Imagine thick, humid air that seems as if it could be cut with a knife. A continuous ringing of cicadas fills the ears, drowning out even the distant hum of diesel engines. Red dust, ubiquitous and ingrained, covers the face, hands, and rifle scope with a thin layer. The calendar reads mid-September 1987. The location is not marked on maps, but geographically, it is the southern part of Angola, a territory where officially there are no Soviet military specialists, only modest agronomists, engineers, and doctors who have come to help the fraternal people build a bright future. However, this agronomist is now lying in tall grass, blending with the landscape, and has a man in desert camouflage in his sights. A man who is just as officially not listed on any roster of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. At this moment, thousands of kilometers from home, at a point where the geopolitical interests of two superpowers converge, a silent dialogue between two professionals takes place. Neither of them will pull the trigger for the sake of a loud slogan. This is a chess game where living people serve as pieces, and the loser simply disappears, dissolving into the haze of the African sunset. Here, in the green hell, something more significant than the fate of a particular convoy or strategic height is being decided. Here, the very architecture of global confrontation is being tested for strength, where the rules are written in blood. But the ink for these rules is invisible. To understand the nature of these clashes, we need to turn back time and look at the global map of the world through the eyes of the strategists of that era. The Cold War is generally considered a time of frozen tension, when nuclear missiles slumbered in their silos, and politicians exchanged notes of protest. But this is an illusion created to reassure ordinary citizens. In reality, the planet was boiling. From the mid-60s until the end of the 80s of the 20th century, the world was a giant chessboard, where the hot squares were the jungles of Latin America, the sands of the Middle East, and the savannas of Africa. Nuclear parity made direct confrontation impossible. It would guarantee the complete cessation of civilization. Therefore, the war went into the shadows. It became a war of special services, a war of proxy forces, and, most importantly, a war of phantoms. A special term appeared, plausible deniability. This was the golden currency of that era. Both the Soviet Union and the United States needed people who could solve problems outside the legal framework, outside official diplomacy, and even outside military logic. Thus, the cast of liquidators and deep cover specialists was born. These people did not exist in the sztatnych rozpisaniach, staffing tables, of regiments and divisions. Their personal files were kept in safes marked top secret, and before being sent on assignment, their biographies were erased, as if by an eraser on paper. They were given new names, new legends, new lives. A GRU Special Forces officer would transform into a translator for a trade mission, while a CIA operative would become a volunteer for a humanitarian organization. But beneath their civilian clothes beat the hearts of predators, and among their personal belongings in their luggage were hidden the tools of their true craft. Angola became the ideal proving ground for this shadow war. The country, torn by internal conflict, turned into a magnet for foreign interventionists. On one side were government troops, supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. On the other were UNITA rebels, backed by South Africa and the USA. But this was only the external facade. Deep within this conflict, another war was being fought, a hunt for specialists. The task of Soviet military advisors was not only to train local personnel. They had to engage in direct confrontation with foreign instructors who coordinated the actions of the militants. Imagine a tactical situation. A group of Soviet advisors accompanies a convoy of equipment. Officially, they have no right to engage in combat. Their task is observation and consultation. But when grenade launchers begin to fire from the zelenki, dense vegetation, and the airwaves explode with foreign speech, instructions take a back seat. At such moments, it became obvious that the enemy was perfectly aware of the route, departure time, and cargo composition. This meant that professional intelligence was operating somewhere nearby, and then the counter-game began. Special purpose groups went on raids not to seize territory, but to neutralize specific sources of threat, those very ghosts from the opposite side. The outer layer of this conflict was filled with dust, sweat, and the smell of burnt gunpowder. Operatives had to act in conditions for which it was impossible to prepare at training grounds in central Russia. Africa dictated its own terms. Weapons behaved differently. Metal became so hot in the sun that it burned hands. Sand clogged even the most reliable mechanisms, and radio batteries discharged twice as fast due to the heat. But the main problem was not the equipment, but identification. In the conditions of maneuver warfare in the bush, where there is no front line, it was incredibly difficult to understand who was in front of you. Opponents often wore uniforms without insignia. Weapons could be anything. The Soviet Kalashnikov assault rifle was valued by Americans for its reliability, and our specialists sometimes used captured samples to conduct false flag operations. This created an atmosphere of total paranoia. Every person encountered could turn out to be an enemy. Every sound in the night could be the last. In this environment, only those with an animalistic instinct and absolute professional composure survived. There was no place for heroism in the cinematic sense here. No beautiful duels at sunset. Victory often went to those who could wait longer, who could lie in ambush for 3 days without moving, subsisting on dry rations and water from a flask, to make one single precise shot or guide aviation to a camouflaged camp. However, external conflict is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the bulletproof vests and tactical gear lay a deep internal rift. The psychology of a person who officially doesn't exist is deformed in a special way. Imagine waking up every morning with the thought that if your path is cut short today, your homeland will disown you. No solemn farewells, no obituaries in central newspapers. At best, a classified decree and a pension for the family for the loss of a breadwinner in the line of duty, without specifying the place and circumstances. This created enormous pressure. Operatives lived a double life even within their own thoughts. They had to write letters home, talking about peaceful life, about building bridges or harvesting crops, while an hour ago they had been in a firefight. This lie for salvation corroded the soul. The need to constantly wear a mask, even in front of their own, created a vacuum of loneliness. The only people who could understand their state were their comrades in arms, who were nearby, and, paradoxically, their enemies. Between professionals on different sides of the barricades, a strange, twisted respect arose. They understood each other better than politicians in cozy offices in Moscow or Washington understood them. They breathed the same dust, suffered from the same diseases, experienced the same fear. There are known cases when, during brief lulls or in neutral zones, unspoken contacts occurred. Exchanges of glances, gestures, sometimes even cigarettes. This was not betrayal. It was an acknowledgement of the fact that they were gladiators in the same arena, hostages of the same game. But as soon as an order came, this respect did not prevent them from carrying out the task of eliminating an opponent with maximum efficiency. The internal conflict was exacerbated by the fact that many of them were intellectuals. The best were selected for the special services. These were people who knew foreign languages, understood history and psychology. They couldn't help but ask themselves questions. Being in the thick of events, they saw the underside of politics. They saw how ideology crumbled when confronted with reality. Local leaders who swore allegiance to Marxism-Leninism or the ideals of democracy often turned out to be ordinary warlords fighting for power and resources. A Soviet officer, risking his life in the Angolan swamps, began to understand that his sacrifice might be in vain, that geopolitical interests are changeable and life is singular. And here we come to the third, deepest layer, the ideological conflict. Officially, it was a battle of two systems, communism and capitalism. But at the __0_ level, everything was different. Ideology faded under the scorching sun. Only bare professionalism and a sense of duty remained. But duty to whom? To an abstract idea or to specific people standing nearby? Soviet __1_ were raised on the ideals of internationalism. They sincerely believed that they were helping oppressed peoples free themselves from colonial oppression. But reality made its own adjustments. They saw poverty, corruption, cruelty on both sides. Their counterparts from the CIA also often lost their illusions, realizing that, "two" often turned into supporting dictatorial regimes as long as they were loyal. At this point, a philosophical breakdown occurred. War turned into work, hard, dirty, dangerous work that had to be done well, just to survive oneself and save the lives of one's people. The ideological vacuum was filled by a personal code of honor. Don't abandon your own. Don't shoot unarmed people unless dictated by extreme necessity. Follow orders, but maintain a human face as much as possible. This unwritten code was the only anchor that kept them from complete moral decay. In the deserts of the Middle East or the jungles of Africa, they defended not so much state flags, but the very concept of officers' honor, which remained unchanged regardless of the political system. The turning point in this story comes when the rules of the game suddenly change. In the late 80s, geopolitical tectonics began to move. Perestroika began in the Soviet Union. Priorities began to shift. Suddenly, those who had risked their lives for years on distant frontiers felt the ground slipping from under their feet. The center stopped responding to requests. Supplies were interrupted. Intelligence information became contradictory. In one episode, reconstructible from fragmented veterans' memories, a special forces group found itself blockaded in a mountainous region on the border with a neighboring country. They had accomplished their mission, intercepting a caravan carrying the latest portable anti-aircraft systems, which could have shifted the balance of power in the region. But evacuation never came. The helicopter meant to pick them up at the rendezvous point remained at the airfield. The reason? A political decision __0_ on the eve of important international negotiations. The group was left to its own devices. This was a moment of truth, a moment of transformation. From instruments of state will, they became expendable. It was in such moments that the true essence of these men was revealed. They did not panic, did not surrender. They decided to break through on their own, using all their accumulated experience and the fury of cornered wolves. They had to traverse hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory, evading pursuit, using captured equipment, and foraging for food. This was no longer a fight for an idea. It was a fight for the right to exist. At that moment, they realized that the greatest danger came not from an enemy with an M16 rifle, but from the indifference of their own system, which could forget about them for the sake of a grand gesture at a diplomatic reception. The culmination of this shadow war was not marked by the capture of a capital or the signing of a surrender. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was a series of local yet incredibly intense operations to wind down their presence. When it became clear that the Soviet Union was withdrawing, the main task was not to win, but to leave honorably, leaving no traces. Archives needed to be destroyed, agent networks evacuated, unique equipment removed. In one Middle Eastern country, amidst the chaos of a burgeoning civil war, a group of _1_ received orders to ensure the safe withdrawal of a diplomatic mission. The embassy building was encircled tightly. Local factions, sensing the giant's weakness, were preparing for an assault. The situation was critical. Official help would not arrive in time, and so the phantoms emerged from the shadows one last time. They occupied key positions around the perimeter of the block. They were pitifully few, just a dozen men against hundreds of armed fanatics. But these were masters of the highest caliber. They created the illusion of a large military presence. Sniper fire was so dense and accurate that the attackers could not raise their heads. Engineering barricades, erected in a matter of hours, turned the streets into a labyrinth of traps. Electronic warfare jammed the militants' communications, sowing panic in their ranks. For 48 hours, this handful of men held the defense, allowing a convoy with civilians and documents to break through to the airport. In the finale of this drama, as the last plane lifted off the runway, the operatives dissolved into the city. They departed along pre-planned routes, changing their appearance, documents, and legends. They disappeared as silently as they had appeared. There was no victory parade. There was no orchestra. Only fatigue and the understanding that an era had ended. They had completed their work to the very end, even as the country that had sent them was already beginning to fall apart. What significance do these events hold today? Why should we remember people whose names have been erased from history? The resonance of those distant events is still heard. The methods and tactics developed in those shadow wars formed the basis of modern special operations forces. The concept of hybrid warfare, so much discussed today, was born precisely then, in the sands and jungles of the 70s and 80s. But the main lesson lies in the realm of the human spirit. The history of these phantoms teaches us that true professionalism does not require public recognition. This is a story of loyalty to duty in conditions where the very concept of duty is blurred. It is a reminder of the price of geopolitical ambitions. Every line in a history textbook is paid for by the fates of specific individuals, many of whom remained nameless. We see that even in the harshest, most inhumane conditions, a person is capable of maintaining their inner core. The paradox is that precisely these people, trained to eliminate and destroy, often showed more humanity and understanding of the value of life than those who sent them on these assignments. Today, as the world again stands on the threshold of global transformations, the experience of the Red Era is more relevant than ever. It shows that behind the loud statements of politicians, there is always the quiet, invisible work of professionals. And that sometimes the world is kept from falling into an abyss not thanks to signed treaties, but thanks to the composure and coolness of a few people looking at each other through sights in a neutral zone. Concluding this narrative, let's mentally return to the beginning. Imagine an old man sitting on a bench in an ordinary park somewhere in Voronezh, or suburban Kimchi. He feeds pigeons, squinting at the autumn sun. Passers-by see him as a simple retiree, perhaps a former engineer or teacher. None of them suspect that this man knows what the air smells like before a sandstorm in the Negev desert, what a jungle forest sounds like a second before an attack, and what the weight of a decision is on which the life of an entire unit depends. His medals lie in a distant drawer, most of them commemorative. The true awards he carries within himself. These are scars that are unseen, and a memory that doesn't fade. Sometimes, closing his eyes, he again sees that red Angolan dust and feels the weight of a rifle in his hands. He is one of those who officially didn't exist. He is a ghost of a bygone era, a living witness to how great powers played their cruel games. And as long as he lives, this story also lives, hidden in secret archives and in the silence of people like him. A story of a war without flags, where the victor is indistinguishable from the loser, and the only trophy remains life itself, preserved against all odds. This is their main victory. They survived to remember, even if the world would prefer to forget. This shadowy chronicle does not tolerate fuss. It demands careful, thoughtful reading between the lines. For it is there, in the gaps between official reports, that the real truth about that time is hidden. The truth about people who were the shield and sword of their countries while remaining invisible. Their war ended, but the echo of their footsteps still resounds in the corridors of history, reminding us that reality is always more complex and profound than it seems at first glance. And perhaps right now, somewhere else on the globe, new phantoms are writing a new chapter of this endless book, hoping that someday their story will also be told, even without names and dates, but with the same respect for their difficult and thankless craft.